no worries. Sorry to everyone that I'm going to be speaking in English because my Arabic is not the best. So if there's anything that you need clarification, just let me know and I'll try my best to explicate what I'm saying in Arabic, or maybe Abuna can help, and yeah. So we'll see how we go. Now, I haven't attended the previous talks that you've had over the last few weeks, so I'm not really sure what's been provided in terms of information about raising teens and strategies as to how to manage your relationship with your teenagers and manage their behaviours and things like that. But Abuna asked me to cover a very specific aspect, which is how to deal with the more difficult behaviours and very practical aspects as to how to do that. Now, one thing I'm not going to be doing in this talk is I'm not going to be explaining too much about why teens do what they do or why we use the strategies, because then, you know, we could be talking for 2 or 3 hours. So the information that I've collated here together as part of this talk, they're not my strategies, it's not information that's coming from my head. These are strategies that have been researched over years and over decades, probably more than 30 years of research, that it's not just one study, but lots and lots of different studies together. And this information is based on the consensus, because not every study agrees 100% of the time with other studies, but these are the things that we know for sure as to what to do, and they work across different cultures, they work across different societies, because we're all human beings, and these studies look for the things that are common in human beings across every society and every culture. And so when we apply these strategies, you can do further research as to why we're going to use these strategies. But like I said, I'm hoping that previous talks that you've attended over the last few weeks probably focused a little bit more on explaining why teenagers think the way they do and why they behave the way they do. And I'm just going to be, so sorry if I upset anyone with some of the recommendations in terms of strategies that we use. They're not my strategies, but they're the evidence-based research strategies that psychologists and health professionals, so whenever you attend a parenting program, it's based on evidence-based research. But as Abuna was saying before, there are lots of things that are really important that are not covered by the evidence-based research. So the evidence-based research, of course, in psychology doesn't really take into account spirituality, doesn't take into account prayer and all those things. Obviously, as a church, we have a different opinion in the sense that, spirituality is something that is essential when it comes to every aspect of our lives, including raising teens as well. So because I'm focusing on just the last 2 points here out of these 5, so when you have a look at positive parenting is a term that's used by the research to indicate a very specific style of parenting. It doesn't just mean being positive with your kids. That's not what that means. What that means is it's a very specific set of strategies that a lot of the time is not common sense. So you'll find a lot of things when you read positive parenting research-based strategies, you're going to find that a lot of it, you're going to look, think about it and think, that doesn't sound right, but it works. So there's a lot of things that we commonly don't believe that actually work. And a lot of it's common sense as well. A lot of it, are strategies that you think, oh yeah, that's logical, that sounds right. But essentially what positive parenting does is it removes punishment from the equation. So, and it uses something that we call logical consequences. So discipline, because I'm only talking about discipline today, I'm not talking about, so imagine building a house and you're building the foundation of the house. These days they build houses with concrete slabs, right? Now, if that concrete slab is not level or there's something wrong with it, and then you start building the structure on top of it, doesn't matter how beautiful that structure is, it's going to have cracks in it in the long term if it's not built properly. it's not worth building the structure. The structure could even cause problems. So if it's not built on the right foundation. So I'm not covering the foundation today. I'm assuming that the foundation is there. Prayer is happening at home, but not just prayer. Also, a lot of the things that positive parenting include, such as having a lot of affection at home, having a very good relationship between the parents. If this relationship isn't there between the parents, and there's a lot of arguments at home, and these arguments and disagreements are had in a very bad way, I'm going to be very honest with you. What I'm talking about today, keep it in the back of your mind, but don't apply it, because applying something like this is like putting it on a bad foundation, and then there's going to be more cracks. So there are kids that are off the rails, or their behaviour is very unmanageable, and they need to go and see a psychologist, for example. And maybe a lot of it stems back from what's happening at home. Things aren't stable between the parents, and there's a lot of abuse going on at home and whatnot. Now, that's the foundation. So psychologists will actually say to the family, don't start using typical positive parenting, managing misbehaviour strategies. We need to fix a lot of things first before we start getting into there. Otherwise, there's going to be the foundation, the structure is going to crumble. So be very aware and keep these things in the back of your mind, but be very aware that the foundation needs to be laid properly, and there needs to be a positive home environment, especially a good relationship between the parents. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to have disagreements. We're going to have disagreements as parents with each other, but it's the way that those conversations are had between the parents that means a lot. So, for example, if parents are disagreeing about the finances and how they should manage their financial affairs, and one person, in the relationship says to the other, I don't, they start shouting at each other and say, no, I don't agree with you. I don't think we should do this. And they're showing a lot of inflexibility. Teenagers that are witnessing this kind of communication are more likely to engage. And the research makes it very clear that 100% they're more likely to engage in more risky behaviours. But families don't know that. They don't link what's happening at home or their relationship, the relationship between spouses, with risky behaviours that teenagers engage in. They put it down to, they must have bad friends. Well, why do you think they might have bad friends in the first place? And there's a lot of kids who have bad friends, but what happens is they can pick up very quickly that that's not the right direction for them, and then they'll change their friends or something along those lines. So a lot of it goes back to what's happening at home. So I'm going to be focusing on these last 2 points here, managing problem behaviours, and then there's risky behaviours. When teenagers get a little bit older, around the age of 14, 15, they might potentially, even from the age of 11 or 12 these days, it's getting younger and younger, they start engaging in quite risky behaviours. So we'll move forward. The difference between kids, when I say kids, we're talking up to the age of about 10, possibly 12, and adolescents or teenagers from the age of 12 and above. So with children, especially the ones that are very young, at around 5 or 6 years old, especially, look, it's not until a child gets to about the age of 3, 2.5, 3 years old, that you can start to implement a lot of these positive parenting strategies and managing misbehaviour. Before the age of 2.5, you don't really manage much misbehaviour. So with children, you need to give a lot of instruction. With teenagers, what we've noticed is parents give teenagers instructions as much as what they did when those kids were younger. And what you've got to be careful of is you shouldn't be instructing teenagers as much as what you'd be instructing kids. So if you're instructing teenagers a lot of the time, be very careful, because teenagers don't take that in the right way. That's fantastic for kids, but doesn't work well with teenagers, especially because their brain is developing, and it's not their fault, it's God's plan. Their brain is developing into becoming more independent. They start wanting to venture out from their parents, and that's healthy and that's normal. And it's most of the time it's because of the parents' fear. They hear things in the media, they hear things from their friends or from people that haven't really looked at the research, And there are even so-called experts out there that say things that scare you, from allowing your kids to be a little bit independent. So what happens is, because of the excessive number of rules, there's nothing wrong with setting rules and limits, but because of the excessive number of limits, this actually might work okay and keep you calm in the meantime, but in the long term, it works against the teenager's brain in terms of trying to develop independence, doesn't allow them to do that. And that fear that the parents have, the teenagers, they don't feel fear, but they feel frustration from that. The parents are afraid, but the teenagers become frustrated. And there's other ways to operate rather than to stop your children from doing things. They can't go over their friends' houses. They can't go to camps. They can't go to here or there, right? Sometimes that's a bit too excessive. And rather than having that approach, sometimes it's better to allow them to do things, but to have a plan with them. It means more communication, more effort. So you need to invest a lot of time, quality time, and effort in raising your children. And one thing that's really important, like I said, we rule out punishment completely. This is the ideal. There is no punishment. There is what we call logical consequences. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between a consequence and punishment? There's a few points here that I'll mention. A punishment is something that is usually unpredictable. So a parent will get very angry, and it's based on that anger that they might just arbitrarily say, okay, that's it. You've done this. You can't go out tonight, right? But the child didn't know that that's what the punishment would be. For all they know, they could have been banned from, something they were going to attend next week, or from, playing the computer for a little bit longer today. It could have been anything. So punishment is usually random. It's not organized. And it's usually a reaction from the parent that's trying to put fear into the child so it stops them from doing the same thing again. And guess what? It works. But it only works for a certain period of time. What happens is, when that teenager gets older and they don't need to rely on their parents as much, or the frustration just builds up so much, what happens is they stop being afraid and they start being really angry. So the psychological problems that it's causing all along while the punishment is being used discourages any kind of open conversation that the teenager is going to have towards their parent. And it also builds up feelings of frustration. They might explode. They're much more likely to engage in harmful behaviours later on in life. We see a lot of priest kids, for example, or kids that were, you look from the outside or even sometimes from the inside and you see that they were raised extremely well, but there was a lot of limits and a lot of punishment. And then even when they get older, 18, 19, and then they're more likely to engage in risky behaviours, things that you would think, what happened there? This child was raised in such a good environment. Well, that's the psychology behind it. There were too many limits, too much fear on the parent, too much punishment that was used. I'm not necessarily talking about physical punishment where they're hit or anything like that. Sometimes the emotional messages that punishment gives to the children is more harmful than, than getting hit. I hope that there are no teenagers or children that are being hit, but that's the psychological mechanism and damage that it causes. So that's one thing about punishment. It's random. It's based on emotion. It's fear-based. Logical consequences are different. Logical consequences are, there needs to be a consequence, because without a consequence, you don't know where to stop. You don't know where the limits are. So consequences sort of set part of setting the boundaries. There are other things apart from consequences that obviously set limits and boundaries, such as setting rules in your house and things like that. But making sure that you give your teenager a consequence is part of kind of like making the boundaries very clear. And what that does is it does something to the children in the household that they don't realize, which is it gives them security. It gives them emotional security. It helps with their self-esteem, because there's something about structure that gives us as human beings, like, even think about it, when you go to work, if you go to work and, there's no organization and you just started a job, and you enjoy the job, but then the management is all over the place. One day it makes this decision, one day nobody communicates with, nobody knows what boundaries are. You're going to start to feel insecure in that workplace. Something inside your mind is going to make you feel a bit worried. The same thing happens at home with teenagers as well. There needs to be consequence, and these consequences need to be logical. So it's not random like punishment. They need to be pre-talked about. So the teenager needs to know that if they do this, this is what's going to happen. And it has to be something related to the behavior that they're doing, not something random. So I'll give examples actually of that later on. But one thing to keep in mind about logical consequences is that they're not to be used as a threat. How many times as parents do we say, be careful, because if you do this, I'm going to take this away from you, all right? Or if you do this, this is what I'm going to do, or you're not going to go here or there. What that does is it actually makes you weaker as a parent. Okay, have you ever thought about that? Because the fact that you need to use a threat makes you weak. Why do you need to use a threat? Why do you not just implement it straight away? With kids, typically in positive parenting programs, they say you give an instruction a maximum of 2 times. And the third time is not an instruction, the third time is you apply the consequence. With teenagers, it's no more than once. So the instruction is just once, and then you implement the consequence straight away, and that consequence is not random, it's something that's predictable, and you have to do it in a calm way, and you have to do it immediately, and you have to do it decisively, and there's never to be any threats that you're going to use punishment. There's no reminders that you're going to use punishment. You don't remind them, you don't threaten, it's just done. And the science behind that is that it makes it such that there's no emotional messages there. It rules out frustration, it rules out, it improves the communication between the parent and the child. It seems more fair to the child as well. And the logical consequence, like I said, has to be tied to the behaviour. It has to make sense. Whereas if you say, oh, you hit your brother or your sister, I told you not to be rough, and therefore you're not going to play video games today. What does video games have to do with not keeping your hands to yourself? You know, they're 2 different things. So therefore that's what makes that one a punishment. So consequences have to be logical to the actual, they have to be tied into the actual behaviour. And
yeah. Tell us, like, what kind of consequences would apply when a child hit his brother?
Yeah, so I'm going to use an example, a specific example for that coming up in the next couple of slides. What else do I say about punishment? Punishment is usually done very emotionally. So there's usually a lot of anger and shouting, and there's emotional messages. Logical consequences have to be done in a way where you don't seem happy, you don't seem sad or angry. So if you're having any of these feelings, you've got to hide them in that moment. And you've got to remain calm. Your voice is not too loud, it's not too soft. You've got to be very neutral, in other words, when you're applying a logical consequence. And the pure science behind it is that the logical consequence is not supposed to put any fear. You know, fear happens more when, oh, what just happened? Mum just cancelled my subscription to whatever it was, right? But logical consequences, they already know what's coming. So what that does is that because they're not going to enforce the consequence, their brain is not developed like an adult. The brain doesn't actually fully develop, by the way, till the age of 25 on average. So the parent must apply the consequences. But as a parent, you can apply a consequence to yourself, and you can be disciplined with yourself. Some adults can't, even when they reach the age of 50 or 60, but they're, exceptions. But as adults, we can do that because our brain is fully developed. So we need to be the ones that apply the consequences. And scientifically speaking, that gives them time for their body to self-regulate and for them to self-regulate their emotions. Their brain needs time to kind of put aside or process the emotions that cause them to disobey or to do whatever, it's all emotion-based. It's all based on thoughts that lead to emotions, and therefore they act in a certain way. And sometimes these emotions aren't necessarily boredom or frustration or anger or negative emotions. Sometimes they're positive emotions. Sometimes kids actually misbehave because they're feeling too happy or excited. So you have to help them to regulate that as well. So the consequence has to apply no matter what. And the science behind it is that when you learn how to just kind of sit for a while, like say if they're not going to go out that night, hopefully that is a logical consequence. That gives them the time to be able to regulate their emotions, not to put fear into them, but to be able to then behave appropriately the next time. So we'll go to the next thing here that helps us to apply what we've been saying. Part of the boundary setting is setting family rules. Most families don't have rules because we don't think of that as something that would help. We're very reactive rather than proactive. So what we need to do is and this applies, by the way, for young children as well, but the way we implement those rules and the way we apply consequences is completely different between children and adolescents. So with adolescents or teenagers, even in a household of teenagers that are up until the age of 16, 17, once they reach the age of 18, you could still have family rules, but they become less relevant. So the idea behind family rules is don't have too many rules. Have a few rules and try to choose rules as parents that address problem behaviours that happen often in your household. So just because some of your friends use certain rules, don't think to yourself, oh, those rules sound nice, I'm going to apply them to my household, because you could have completely different children with completely different behaviours. So you've got to find family rules that work well for your household and your family. So if you have, and it depends on the dynamic as well. So if you've got boys, the dynamic with boys is going to be different to with girls. Boys tend to be a lot more physical and things like that. So if you're in a house of all girls, you may not have a rule that says, keep your hands and feet to yourself. But if you're in a household where you've got boys and girls and the boys are hitting the girls and they're hitting each other and there's those sorts of dynamics, then you might have that as part of your house rules. So think about the rules that get the behaviours that are most problematic, and then form positive rules around that. And when I say that's the next point, positive, all that means is the rule is to be stated in a positive way. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about why it's to be stated in the positive rather than the negative, because there's a whole bunch of research behind that. But so I use the example of children, being rough or violent with each other. If that's happening very often, don't have the rule state, don't hit each other, right? Because that's a negative statement. It's got to be a positive statement, which is keep your hands and feet to yourself. If, for instance, you've got a lot of arguments that are happening in the household because people are taking each other's stuff. One sibling is taking the other sibling's stuff, or your parents, your kids take stuff from your room or whatever it is, and there's a lot of that going on, then you wouldn't say don't take anyone else's belongings. You would say, have a rule that says something along the lines of, you must ask the family member, you must ask before you borrow something, right, for example. They have to be fair. So what fair means is pretty much that it's applied to everybody in the household, including the parents as well. So it's better to have rules that you can follow, that you're prepared to follow, rather than having rules that you expect just them to follow. So even if you have a rule about a curfew, that you've got to come home by 10 o'clock, make sure that you follow that rule as well, because it works better when parents follow. And make sure they're easy to enforce or easy to follow, rather than setting them up for failure. So come up with a rule that's more reasonable. So if it's hard for them to come back home before 10 o'clock, maybe push it to 10:30. What's wrong with pushing it to 10:30 instead of 10 o'clock or something along those lines? It's not, the end of the world. Directed discussion. So this is another approach within this whole positive parenting approach specifically for managing misbehaviour. Just reminding you that we're not building the foundations here. This is a much, much later step. We're assuming that there's good foundations there. So you should have a regular family meeting. Could be like once a week or once a month. This is where you can use that opportunity to discuss, like give feedback and discuss things that have happened and discuss the family rules, whether everybody's following them, whether people want to adjust them, how they're going with it, all that kind of stuff. But with directed discussion, so this is if a rule is a problematic behaviour has occurred. So let's just say there's a behaviour that happens that isn't there in the house rules. That's okay. You just address that behaviour separately and apply a logical consequence and all that kind of stuff. But if a rule is broken, let's just say we use that example of the child who's walked into one of their siblings' rooms and they've taken one of their belongings and they walk past and you notice that they've taken something. So you've got to use that opportunity. As a parent, don't look at that as, oh, they're a problem child. Oh, look at this. Don't look at that as a negative thing. Look at it as a positive thing, because whenever you pick out that they're doing something wrong, don't tell them that they're wrong, but that's an opportunity to shape their behaviour. It's an opportunity to shape their morals sometimes. It's an opportunity to have a discussion with them and actually create a better emotional self-regulation. It's an opportunity to help them manage their emotions better, because if they can manage their emotions better, they're going to be more likely to be able to study better, to be able to hold relationships better in the future, better marriage, better focus in their work, because emotions are our biggest problem. That's the reason why people get in trouble, why certain people can't keep jobs or relationships. It's as human beings, we're very emotional creatures, so we've got to learn how to self-regulate these emotions. So the first thing you do is you've got to gain their attention. Now, this seems like common sense and logical, but think about it. How many of us, when we've noticed our child doing something that we don't like, how many times do we gain their attention? Or do we just go up to them straight away and say, or what's going on? Or why did you do this, right? You ask them the why question. It's a very aggressive question to ask. Why did you just take, didn't I tell you not to take, such and such from, whatever it is. So the first step is to, in a very neutral way, again, you're not happy, you're not sad, you're not angry, just very neutral. You say their name. So if their name's Bishoy, you say Bishoy and you make eye contact. You don't yell it out from across the other end of the room. You briefly explain to them how the rule was broken, or you can ask them, do you know why I've gained your attention, or can you tell me what you've done, or what's our house rule about that, or something like that. And if they know and they're just mucking around and they say, I don't know, or whatever, then you just simply ask them, what should we do? Or you state, the house rule is that we must ask before we borrow something. And then you kind of just pause for a little bit, try to foster that independence, see if they're just going to do it on their own, after a few seconds, rather than being too directive. And if they go and do it, then make sure you actually praise them. Don't just sort of think to yourself, because a lot of people do this. They just think, oh, thank God he's done it. Thank God he's gone back and done it. But you think to yourself, I don't want to give it too much attention, so I don't want to praise him or her or anything like that, because, if I praise them, then I'm going to be bringing attention to the whole negative behaviour that they did in the first place. It doesn't work like that. You need to praise them. So you need to actually say, thank you for putting it back. I really appreciate that, something like that. So that's pretty much directed discussion. Making clear, calm requests. So sometimes they're not going to do anything wrong, but you're going to need to instruct them to do something. Remember how I said before that instructions are much more relevant for, frequent instructions, are much more relevant for young children, whereas by the time they become teenagers, there should be very little instruction. So the times where there are instruction, choose the right moment, because what happens a lot is parents think that they're the boss. They are in a way, but they abuse that privilege, I call it. And they will have this mentality, this deep core belief. No one ever says it, but there's this core belief, probably especially in certain cultures and especially in our very traditional Egyptian mindsets, we've got this idea that my child, whether a child or a teenager, they have to listen to me. And if they're watching, if they're in the middle of a show, I have to stop them and they have to listen to what I'm saying. But think about, like, you might be in a hurry or something like that, but is it going to hurt if you wait another 5 minutes to when there's a commercial or when the show's over? So if there's opportunities to wait, it's not going to affect your authority as a parent, okay? So if you think that it's going to affect your authority, if you think it's going to take power from you, it doesn't. Then the research makes that very clear. So rest assured that the research shows that giving them that consideration, just the same way that you want to be considered and people don't just interrupt you when you're doing something, give them that as well, right? When they're little children, it's a little bit different, but as teenagers, they need that. Be very clear and specific with your instructions. So don't be vague, make it very clear what you want to say, and then allow time for cooperation. That time, they say it's usually, could be, depending on what you want them to do, between 30 seconds and 5 minutes. So give them the time for cooperation. Don't think that they have to do it straight away, because they might have emotions that you're triggering when you ask them to do something, and because they're teenagers, even if you ask them nicely, they might still have some negative emotions there. I don't like being told what to do. No teenager likes being told what to do. So allow them time for cooperation, because they might actually they might actually need some time to manage those thoughts that are in their head. But if you jump in too early, then you've caused the problem straight away. And then offer praise if they do it. Same thing with the directed discussion, or a logical consequence if it's relevant. So let me find an example of this. Sorry. Oh, here we go. We're going to go into logical consequences. So 10 to 30 minutes is usually long enough for a logical consequence. Any more than that starts to become a punishment, because scientifically speaking, it doesn't take a human being, especially like a teenager into adulthood, an hour or 2 hours to calm down. It only takes maybe, think about when you're really angry. You could be angry for 10, 20 minutes, but it's usually going to last for longer than half an hour. Probably not. You're going to calm down. You might go back to being angry again when you think about it again, but usually it takes the body about 30 minutes. That's what a consequence is. The parent is actually thinking about the science rather than thinking, how can I put fear into my child to get them to do what I want them to do? If the behaviour occurs frequently or again on the same day, then the time should be, that's telling you that the time should be increased. They need more time to be able to manage their thoughts and manage their emotions. And every kid's different. Some kids might do it after 30 seconds. Other kids, it takes them a lot longer to manage there's no set rule as to how long exactly it takes, a teenager to be able to recuperate and manage their emotions and then be ready to behave appropriately. And like I said before, never threaten to apply a consequence. So let's just say, I'll give you an example. I wanted to, what you were asking before about what's an example of a logical consequence and things like that. So let's just say you're on a typical example. You're on the phone with a friend, and then you've got your teenager in the background, and they're playing really loud music. So what do you do in that situation? So let's follow what we've talked about so far. How many times do you give them the instruction? Just once, okay? Not twice, just once. So best thing to do is to just say, look, you tell your friend, look, just give me a second. You go and instruct them, look, can you please turn the music down? Let's just say you go, and they say, okay, right? They say, okay, I'll turn it down. You go back, you start talking to your friend again, and you realise after 30 seconds, the music is still cranking and it's still up in the background, and you start feeling like really, frustrated, and you start thinking about all the misbehaviours that they do. By the way, these misbehaviours are healthy. The fact that teenagers are testing the limits, this is signs of a healthy mind. If they didn't do this, we would probably consider that there's something wrong with them intellectually. Maybe there's a disability there or something like that. So teenagers are supposed to test the limits. And I'll tell you, now I'm getting into the why. I told you that I was just going to make this talk about just giving you the strategies. But it's probably worth mentioning this, that remember how I said children grow up and teenagers grow up with better self-esteem when you have consequences, and that's subconsciously they're testing the boundaries. So they don't know why they're testing them. They probably think, oh, I'm just a bad kid. I'm just a naughty kid. That's probably what they're thinking within themselves. But there's something deeper going on in their own minds that they don't know, which is they want to test the limits to see where the wall is, to see where the boundaries are, because that's the human brain. It wants to see if we're safe. And if I go close to the wall and I realize that there's a wall there, I feel safe and secure. If I realize that these walls and these boundaries are constantly moving and there really isn't any boundaries, then subconsciously I start to feel afraid and I become insecure. And if I become insecure, I'm more likely to take drugs and I'm more likely to engage in risky behaviours and all the other things that are going to sort of come later on. So you've told your teenager to to put the music down. They haven't done it. The best thing to do is to tell your friend, look, because it's more important that you deal with your teenage behaviour. You can talk to your friend anytime. So you need to kind of accept, like, don't have this idea that my kids should just do what I say, or they shouldn't interfere with my life and make my life more difficult. No, you've got to be prepared to make your life more difficult if you want to raise good kids. So to make your life more difficult, what you've got to say to your friend is, I'll talk to you later. There's just an issue I've got to deal with at the moment, but I'll give you a call back later. And as frustrating as that is, you're putting in the effort because you're investing in your teenager and you're looking at that as a positive interaction. So then you go and you say, look, I've told you to turn down the music. You haven't done it as I've asked. You haven't turned it off. So therefore, you've got to turn it off. You might even go and turn it off for them. And so immediately, you have to immediately go in there. No threats. Notice how I didn't say the instruction again. I've just told them that they've broken the rule. And it's 10 o'clock, you can turn it on at 10:30. All right? And if they're very difficult and they don't come, and you might think, okay, but what if they don't listen? And they just turn up the music again and whatnot, that might happen. But that's just more testing, because why are they testing too much? Is because there's probably a lot of foundational issues that are there in the first place, in which case some families decide, okay, I've got to go and see a psychologist, or I've got to go and see someone. This is too big for me. But most of the time, people don't need that kind of support, and they can just manage everything at home on their own. And because what's happened inside that teenager's mind is when the parent's done that and they haven't given them a second instruction, they haven't threatened, there's something deep inside that teenager's mind that a button has been pressed almost. Imagine like a button has been pressed, like a security button that says, you've got security. And the more of this kind of security that comes from you giving them consequences in that way, without threats, without punishment, just purely scientific, the more likely it is that they're going to grow up feeling more and more secure. And therefore, you will notice that these testing behaviours are not going to completely go away during the teenage years, but they become much, much less because they already feel secure. There's no need to test the boundaries. But like I said, they have no idea about this. This is just what we psychologists and what the evidence-based research shows. So that's logical consequences. Dealing with, sorry, how are we going with time? Are we a bit? What time should we finish?
We should like 9 something, 15 or
9:15. Okay, I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. Yeah. Sorry?
We might move to the cases.
Okay, all right. So look, there was an extra bit here on dealing with emotions, but I'll skip that bit. There was risky behaviours and how to set up, how to manage risky behaviours and how to plan and things. You can read up on a lot of this stuff, but like I said, this is a big topic and it takes probably 2 or 3 sessions at least to cover it. So we'll go to this case study over here, and then you can feel free to ask questions that are relevant to you and your situations and your families at home and whatnot. But yeah, so this case study here, this is based on a real life example. The name is an alias, so it's not that's not the actual name of the person, just for confidentiality. But let's call him Joshua, and he's 14 years of age. And you might relate to this. So some of your kids might have had similar issues or similar behaviours. So First of all, so this was someone that was seen probably 2 or 3 years ago, and so he used to be quiet, respectable, he was active in sports, but over the last 6 months, his behaviour had changed significantly. His grades had dropped from Bs. He was like an average student, but he was doing pretty well at one point, and then Ds all of a sudden. He was missing assignments, avoiding homework, emotional changes, so he was very frequently angry and irritable, a lot of outbursts. He withdraws to his room a lot. He avoids family meals, just wants to be alone. Peer-related issues, so his friends. He's got a new friend group who's known for skipping class, and he's now joined because he feels he belongs to that group. And he stays out past his limit, his curfew, and he lies about where he is. He's started engaging in risky behaviours. So he's been caught vaping at school, experimenting with alcohol at a friend's house. He starts showing serious communication problems for the first time. So he says, "Leave me alone. You don't understand me. You don't get it." Avoids any kind of conversation, is not open at all with his parents, whereas previously he was. So parents obviously straight away, this is a shock to them. For him, it's not a shock because it's been building up for such a long time. Remember we said all these issues, too many limits, the foundations aren't right. That's what was happening with him. So his parents got shocked and they're overwhelmed. And on top of that, what complicated things further is that the parents were in disagreement with each other and about how they should parent. So one parent, his father favours punishment. He's always used punishment. He's using punishment, and his mother worries that pushing him hard will make things worse. Now, I'm going to ask you a very deep question. It probably sounds like a bit of an unusual question, but do you think that these are signs, all of these things that I've mentioned about Joshua, do you think that these are signs that he's becoming a bad kid? Or do you think that these are typical signs of a teen in distress? The second one, right? But how likely do you think it is that somebody in our community would think the first one? If you be honest with yourself, it's too much, too many cases like this, all right? He's becoming a bad kid. And even if they don't want to say it or admit it, it's in the mind because there's a lot of cultural things, and there's a lot of cultural sayings in Egyptian even that we can't even translate to English that show us that this mentality is not just a one-person problem, it's a cultural, it's a cultural stigma. So again, we've got to be very mindful of this so we can turn that around. So there's a step-by-step approach here. This is how it was actually dealt with. So this was in the real-life therapy setting. This is what was advised to the parents. By the way, he was seen for psychological treatment. Now, in this approach, his parents were advised to use calm, non-confrontational communication because they were using communication that was very confrontational, such as, "Why did you do this? Didn't I tell you not to do this?" Right? So it had to, instead of reacting to the behaviour, in that way, they would have to approach it with curiosity. So they had to learn a completely different way of speaking that was unnatural to them. So they started saying things like, "Joshua, I've noticed you seem more stressed lately and things have been tough. We're not here to punish you. You really matter to us. And we just want to understand what's going on in your mind. Tell us what you're feeling or what's going on." And the reason why we do this is because it reduces defensiveness and arguments back, like they say, "Oh, you don't understand me." And it opens the door to communication. The second point is to set clear, consistent boundaries, because there were no clear, consistent boundaries at home. There were no logical consequence. Everything was reactive. Everything was punishment. And the father was coming down very, very hard with his punishment, and he thought he was being a very good disciplinarian. But what was happening is it was just random. The punishment was random. It's lazy. Punishment, all forms of punishment, is lazy. That's all it is. Logical consequences takes a lot more setting up, a lot more feedback talks about what's going on. There's a lot more effort. So if you're not willing to put the effort in, you just want to be lazy, then punishment has a good short-term outcome, but no one, I don't think any of the parents, us as parents, we just want short-term benefits, right? We do it for the future of our kids. How many times do we talk about the future of the kids and setting them up, to be successful? Well, then you cannot set them up to be as successful as what they can be when there's too much punishment going on. So setting clear boundaries. So the parents started putting these rules that I was talking about before in the household. Homework needs to be done before screen time. Curfew needs to happen at a specific time. When they skip classes rather than punishment, there are very, very predictable consequences that were outlined, that were logical. They had to match the situation, and no more than one instruction. Like I said, it just gets implemented by the parent. So even though Joshua would have, based on these new strategies, Joshua would have probably stamped his feet and said, "Oh, geez, why do you have to, is there any way, I'm sorry what I've done, can you please just, look, I promise I'll go to school tomorrow. I'm sorry that I skipped today." The parents have to say, "No, that's it. This is the consequence, and that's it." And you don't even need to tell them, you already knew what the consequence is going to be. They already know that. The less you talk, the better. Okay? So, yep.
The case of Joshua case is severe, and he changed a lot over 6 months, you said.
Yeah.
And he got stress and change behavior. Do you think even the parents, when they approach him calmly and wisely and set boundaries, he's gonna respond positively at the first term?
He didn't. Obviously he didn't. But they still stuck to that approach regardless. And what they found is that it doesn't happen over days, but over weeks it sort of happened, to the point where maybe after 3 or 4 months they noticed a significant difference. And he was much more open. So I've got another slide that shows you what the outcome was. But offer choices and autonomy, that's another thing that was implemented specifically for him in this particular case. So you can say, for example, things like, you can finish your homework. So rather than saying you have to finish your homework now, or you have to finish it before dinner, no. What you do is you say, you think that they're not children anymore. Okay, so there needs to be those boundaries, but there needs to be that balance. So how you might strike that balance is say, you can finish your homework now or after dinner, but it needs to be done tonight. So it needs to be done tonight. That's the clear boundary. But whether you do it before, whether you do it after, so in other words, they're not completely ready to be independent yet, but you're giving them through your language, you're showing them the willingness, hey, I'm willing to let you go and for you to be a bit more independent. So that's what it does. So psychologically, again, this is the stuff's happening on a subconscious level. The teenager doesn't know about it, but it satisfies their psychological need for independence and reduces power struggles between the parent and child. Then strengthening the relationship is something that needs to be focused on. Spend 10-15 minutes daily is a good exercise to do. Playing a game that they like, or eating food together, like even just going out to a restaurant, the food that they like, or walking the dog. Do things even if you feel tired, even if you're investing in them, you're building that relationship and that bond. It's something that's really important. And that's not separate to the discipline. So the bond directly feeds into the way they're going to react to your approach to discipline, which is logical consequences and all that kind of stuff. And it builds trust. And when you build trust, they're more likely to listen to your suggestions, even if it doesn't logically make sense to them. But we see plenty of wonderful kids in our church who you can see they don't really kind of agree too much with their parents. It doesn't make sense to them just yet. And sometimes the parents might even be wrong, but they still have that respect towards their parents because they've got that positive relationship that the parents have spent so much effort consciously, building the relationship. Monitoring without micromanaging. So there's a difference between surveillance and being on them, 24/7 and watching everything they do and secretly, keeping I would not recommend that you put a tracker on your child's teenager's car or put cameras and they don't know about it or anything like that. That can go terribly wrong. So you need to give them a bit of trust. You need to trust that the effort and the morals and the values that you've instilled in them when they were younger, you need to give them the freedom to start using those things in their life. But if you start treating them as children, like they're still children, and your fear gets in the way, you're going to destroy that relationship with them. And subconsciously, when you're tired and you do things with your child, or when you really, really don't want to do something because you're bored and you find what you have no interest in what your child is doing, but you spend the time doing it regardless, that subconsciously tells them that they're important, and it raises their self-esteem, and it does make a huge difference. Also, when you're talking about their friends, because remember, Joshua's friends he'd been involved with a very bad friend group, don't talk badly about his friends, because that doesn't go well with teens. They don't like you talking badly, and even as Christians, we don't do that. And that usually backfires. They start getting defensive and things like that, because when you're attacking their friends, they also feel that you're attacking them as well, because remember, they're the ones that chose those friends as well. So be very, very careful how you talk about that. So you can say things like, I get that your friends are important. I just want to make sure that the people you spend time with support the goals you care about. So that's a very positive way of actually saying to them, I would like to see you change your friends and go to a different, support group or a different friend group. And encourage that. Try to help them and make suggestions about other peer groups and things like that. And like I said, we've talked about this before, seek professional help if needed. So this was the outcome after about 2 to 3 months with consistent effort. And the parents were also seen as well as Joshua. So there would be weekly sessions with Joshua, and every second or third week there would be just sessions with the parents. The parents started becoming much more... The father changed his approach completely, ruled out punishment completely. And what we found was Joshua started opening up more. His grades stabilised. They decided they wanted a tutoring plan. Like I said, the parents started becoming more aligned in terms of the way they thought about boundaries and discipline. The vaping incident stopped. Relationships improved. He became more open. Family conflict decreased. So that's the case study.
So the vaping issue should be like confronted by the parents. They make him like aware that they know about vaping issue. Yeah, they should
about the
vaping.
Oh, about that specific issue. So,
they have to talk about this clearly with him. We know that you are vaping, and we encourage you to stop for your health sake.
Like it depends on exactly how it happens, but in his case, it was relevant for the parents to say that because he was caught. He was caught by the school, and then but someone from and then somehow got to the school, and then the school then brought it to the parents' attention. So. So he already knew that the parents knew. But there's nothing wrong with we're not here to punish. That's why I said we're not here to punish you. We just want to know what's going on in your mind. And to sort of open that dialogue with him. And you're not even addressing, okay, now you've vaped, now what are we going to do as a consequence? You're not even, that's not how you start the conversation. And you don't punish them for... because remember, the vaping's previous behaviour. Now, he might vape tomorrow, he might vape next week, but you don't punish him for behaviour that he's done before, right? You only punish him for, like, now that he's aware of it, now you've applied the backup consequences, then from that point, you see what he's going to do, and then you start applying consequences. And surely, of course, he's not just going to go overnight from being, very... skipping school and doing all these things. So all of a sudden, in the next week, he's attending school every day. No, of course. And every time the rules are not followed or the behaviour is not positive, you're going to be applying logical consequences quite a lot. But you have to look at that as an opportunity to start quickly and effectively shaping behaviour, helping them to manage their emotions. So you should be looking forward to it as parents. The fact that, you should be looking at his misbehaviour as okay, good. This now means we've got to talk to him. We can teach him something about emotions and all of this stuff. And you put a name to the emotion. There's a lot of stuff that I haven't talked about, by the way. So you implement all of these strategies. But what's concerning, sometimes we do get families where they come to us and they say, oh, this child is really bad, that's what they say, and then there's another child that they've got that's that doesn't cause them any problems at all. And I said, are you sure that child doesn't test the limits? And he's always compliant. And I start getting worried when I hear things like that, right? Because that's not normal. And that is an indication that there is something very, very wrong. But the parents love it and they look at it as, oh, he's the perfect child. But I can guarantee you that something's not right there. And what's going to happen is you're going to see that, maybe not tomorrow or the day after, but you might see that in 5 years' time. And then usually, I actually had a case where the child was about 5, 6 years old, and then that same child, I saw him 10 years later at the age of 14 or 15. And there was something that I couldn't put my finger on. And turns out that they were using a lot of punishment, not physical punishment, and the child was just scared. This child was scared of his father. And then it all came out later on when he was a teenager. He had this click, his brain just clicked and said, why am I afraid of my father? And the father was shocked, and the father had a crisis himself. He needed to go and see a psychologist, and it was just a nightmare, waiting to happen. So when things are going too smooth, and you're not feeling the need to discipline your child or put in place consequences, that's not good. So I'm saying this so that you can look at every opportunity where they misbehave as a normal and as a positive thing, even though it seems negative.
It needs a very well-trained parents, actually. Yeah. So the case of Joshua, like having so much like challenges, so it like covers most of the cases. A case study I have received, a girl or a boy, I don't know, for a family, like used to lie and to steal. So like, what's your advice?
So usually lying or stealing behaviour, there's something we call compulsive lying, or there's a name for compulsive stealing, but I forget what it is. So again, that's a sign of something's not right at home. So we need to go to the core of the issue. So rather than going directly into the problem and trying to apply consequences straight away, we would need to do a whole assessment of what's going on and what's the family history. How did the lying start? Where did it start? How old? What kind of lying? How frequently does it happen? But in general, it's an emotional problem. It's an emotional problem. It's not just something that they've looked at somebody else doing and thought, oh, that's a good idea, I'm going to do that. No, it's usually an emotional problem, and they've latched onto that behaviour. For example, because we have to understand why the lying as well, because that will determine what we do about it. So if the lying is to get attention because that child has abandonment issues, then how do we fix those abandonment issues? If the child is lying because they're getting attention from their friends and their friends think they're cool or whatever, then we address the issues behind that. So it just depends on, why.
When you said like emotional issues, like feeling sad, feeling angry, you mean this kind of emotions that the kid like because of this kind of emotion, the kids like lie or steal?
So, like an example of an emotional issue could be, let's just say insecurity because maybe their parents. This is just a random. This is one of many, many different examples. The father might say, you're not going to be anything. Look at your brother, and look at you, and then they carry that into the school, and because they have that insecurity, they think, okay, my dad doesn't love me. Maybe my friends can love me, and so they try too hard to be the friends. And then when you try too hard to be someone's friend, they don't want to be your friend as much, and so then that feels like abandonment again. So then they might start to lie to make themselves look better. They might start to say, well, guess what I did, and they didn't really do what they said they did, or they start to kind of lie about their personality, or they start to kind of try to pretend to be someone else, and they're not worried about what God thinks of them. They're just worried about what people are thinking of them. It's just because they need to regain, something has been taken away, and they desperately, again, this is happening on a subconscious level, and they need to, it feels really scary not to belong and not to have that, and to lose, because as human beings, we have the need, we call it the need for affiliation. They need to be affiliated with other people, and so all that basically gets compromised or gets threatened, and so it's a make-up sort of behaviour. You know, sometimes people become bullies. And lying is not the problem, but they just bully other people so they can regain a sense of control in their lives because they've lost control. No one loves me. No one. What can I do about it? Or they try to control other people.
So many possibilities. Okay. So أخرناكم، فلو عندكم أسئلة احنا برضو هنعمة ربنا المحاضرات كلها هنلخصها بعربي وانجليزي ونبعتها. احنا بعتنا الاولى ونبعت الثانيه والثالثه ان شاء الله، ونرتب بنعمة ربنا المراجعة زي ما انا قلت على يوم الجمعة 26 ديسمبر. حد عنده اسئلة؟ حد بعت لي حاجة وانا ما قريتهاش؟ برافو عليكم، سمعتوا كل حاجة، فهمتوا كل حاجة، هتطبقوا الحاجات الحلوة دي. اتمنى نصلي. شكرا رمزي، ربنا يخليك. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate your time and your talk. God bless you.